What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Strength Coach Rants. I'm your host, Connor Lyons, and today we're actually going to be talking about how Unit 731 in the Japanese government led you to believe that weight training is bad for kids.
I don't want to hear you, 'cause you cannot master the strength.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about weight training in kids. So probably about 2 years ago, I did an episode on how weight training is beneficial for kids and they should be doing it. And we touched on where this all came from. But today we're actually going to do a pretty deep dive into all of it and what happened and why parents were led to believe for the better part of 8 decades that their kids shouldn't weight train because it's going to stunt their growth. I'll link that in the description because it's actually a really good watch. It's 45 minutes long, but we really dive deep into all the benefits of weight training when it comes to kids, the studies that show how beneficial it is, and all of that. But like I said, we touched on this, but today we're going to kind of dive a little bit deeper into it. So most of us here in the United States are privy to most of the information that came out of World War II concerning Germany, right? The concentration camps, like Dr. Mengele and the experiments that he did on kids. But a lot of us aren't introduced to the horrifying things that happened on the other front of the war. For whatever reason, I don't know. It's just not really included in the curriculum unless you take classes that are pretty specialized in that. I actually took a genocide class when I was up at school at Nichols College playing hockey. And that's where I was first introduced to Unit 731, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So this might be new information to a lot of you. Some of the stuff we talk about today is going to be pretty gross, but it's all going to end up leading to a good place where we kind of tie everything back together. So back during World War II, right, it was the axis of evil versus the Allied powers, and the axis of evil was Italy, Germany, and Japan. And again, like I said, we learn a lot about Germany and Italy here in America because they are Western countries. We really don't learn much about what happened in Japan, other than you probably heard of the rape of Nanking, and that might be the gist of what most people have learned, but the Japanese were basically taking over and enslaving the Chinese all throughout World War II as well. So today, like I said, we're going to talk about Unit 731. Now, Unit 731 was actually also known as the Prevention of Epidemics and Water Supply section of the Japanese imperialist military. And they were tasked with some... I mean, it kind of goes into what the name of them was, right? Because they were dealing with pathogens and they were doing experiments and they were taking prisoners of war, trying to they dealt with the water supply as well. But basically, we're going to go over the 8 things that this unit did as far as experimentation went. So I'm going to be reading off some notes here. So if you catch me not looking at the camera, that's what's happening here. But so essentially, there were what amount to concentration camps over in China, run by the Japanese. After they take over these villages, they would stick people in these camps, and they would run experiments on them. Honestly, a lot of it runs in line with what Dr. Mengele was doing with the Nazis over in Germany, which is wild that we don't hear a lot about this. We actually know how to fix frostbite due to these quote-unquote studies that they were doing on these prisoners. But the 8 things that they were tasked with doing were biological warfare testing, chemical warfare experiments, weapons testing, frostbite research, which we kind of just touched on, surgeries with and without anesthesia, it's kind of crazy, sexual violence and reproductive experiments, contamination studies, and immunization and blood studies. Now, supposedly what all this was done for wasn't just torture. They were trying to find information that could be beneficial to the Japanese government when it came to both their citizens and their military, right? But reading it, you can see they actually collected a lot of data that we use today, and we'll get in at the end of this to why that's the case. But it's torturous data, I guess. We also use a lot of the information that we got from Dr. Mengele in World War II. A lot of that was sponsored by Bayer Aspirin was a big sponsor, paid for quite a bit of research over there, which is nuts. I haven't done a deep dive into the finances of this side of things, like the Unit 731, but I'm sure they had some American corporation sponsor that was running a bunch of this stuff for them. Anyways, so we're going to break each one of these down. Biological warfare testing, right? So like anthrax, the plague, cholera, and typhoid were like the four main ones that I've been able to find information on. And they did this to study the progression of these illnesses. So they would, on purpose, give these prisoners, these anthrax, plague, cholera, typhoid, to see how long they could live, to see if there was something they could give them that would slow it down or get rid of it. And they just watched the progression. Like, these people obviously did not know that they were being injected with this or given this, which makes it really sad because ultimately most of them died. Probably all of them died. And we'll talk about that at the end as well. They'd even put it in the water supply of entire villages and see how the entirety of the village would deal with whatever they happened to get. Many prisoners were also dissected while alive to see how the progression would attack certain like organs and things like that. It's really kind of gross and horrifying to think about. The next one, chemical warfare experiments. So like mustard gas, cyanide, and some other chemical warfare type stuff. They would use protective equipment and they would put it on the prisoners, and they would see which type of protective equipment would protect these prisoners from these chemicals, right? So a lot of them probably didn't make it. It's just kind of the way it went. So they would do some weapons testing, and this would involve explosives testing and flamethrower experiments, and you can probably just imagine what those studies looked like. Nobody survived. And then the frostbite research, right? So one of the reasons that we know how to deal with frostbite and how to regenerate the tissue that has been frozen is because of these studies. So what they would do is they would give these prisoners frostbite. They'd expose them to like extreme cold, and then they would do one of two things. They would try to fix it, right, with either medications or different temperatures or water, or they would break that part off. Like, so for instance, if you froze their hand or like up to their mid forearm, you would break it off and see like how it recovered. And then the lucky few that actually got their tissue like regenerated after the fact, got to keep their limbs, and the ones who didn't probably died. And this again is why we know how to deal with frostbite. It as horrific as it sounds, it probably accelerated that research 100 years because they didn't care about these prisoners whatsoever. They just wanted the outcomes. So they would give surgeries without anesthesia at all. And the whole purpose of this, so they would like remove limbs, they would remove organs, and they would perform other surgeries without any local or general anesthesia. And the purpose of this was to see how resilient the body was and how it dealt with the trauma. Wild. The sexual violence and reproductive experiments, they would forcefully impregnate these women. You can imagine how that happened. And they would give them STDs, and they would see how these things would progress. They would also do forced abortions, and then some of them, just to see how they could do it and what would happen, not just to the pregnancy, but to the woman. Lots of like emotional and psychological like testing here. Pretty brutal. We'll talk more about the experiments on the children later. Contamination studies. So like prisoners would be given some kind of contaminant either by ingesting it or being injected with it. And they wanted to see the body's physiological reactions and like how much would actually kill someone. Kind of crazy. And then immunization and blood studies. So they would do like bloodletting, and they would see how much blood you could lose before you would die. How long it would take for your body to kind of like regenerate enough blood to get back to normal. This was the other one. And then they would also like experimental vaccines to see if both they would protect against, whatever the disease was, or to see how the people reacted to it, or a little bit of both, right? So they did all these things, this Unit 731, and kids weren't off limits. They were part of the experiments as well. And I guess when you like dehumanize somebody to the point of making them no longer human, this doesn't matter anymore, right? So these people who were in the Japanese military, it was just another day at the office. They didn't care because these weren't people anyways, right? That's the mindset that you have to have more than likely to be able to get through these things, or you're just like an evil person who enjoys doing it, which is also equally as awful. So the crazy part about all this, in exchange for all of the data, the U.S. and the Allied forces gave the doctors and the military officers and the military personnel who were doing these experiments complete and total immunity because we got a lot of good information out of them. So all of those horrible things that they did, completely forgiven. They get off scot-free because we did get some valuable data, and that's indisputable. Some of the data was actually very valuable. It's just awful the way that they had to go about getting it. All right, so that's Unit 731 for you. General awful human beings who did experiments on, people they didn't see as humans in an effort to gain some knowledge that could potentially help them on the battlefield and help their people, right? Because if you know how long it takes for certain things like to progress in a healing perspective, or you can figure out how to like speed up that healing, it's a benefit to you. And that's the same thing that was going on in Nazi Germany with some of the stuff Dr. Mengele was doing. Some of the stuff he was doing had no benefit whatsoever. But that was some of the stuff that they were doing was in an effort to help themselves on the battlefield and just medically advance their civilization. All right, so how does that tie into youth weight training? Well, again, like I said, some of these experiments were done on kids. One of the experiments that we didn't kind of touch on in the last one, it goes along with like the surgeries without anesthesia and things like that. They would fracture the bones of these individuals, these prisoners, to see how long it would take for them to heal, right? So this, again, helps out on the battlefield. If you've got somebody with a broken limb, we can either do X, Y, or Z to speed up the healing. Don't do, A or B because that's going to delay the healing. And we need about X amount of time for them to get back to where they're fully operational and can get back on the battlefield to fight. Well, like I said before, they didn't exclude kids from these experiments. And one of the docs, I assume it was a doctor, thought, so the epiphyseal plate, or better known as a growth plate to most people, is a cartilage type space at the end of your bones where your bones grow. That's why they're called a growth plate. Now, these things stay open and very cartilaginous, if that's a word, up until like the end of puberty, and that's when they seal off. That's when your bones don't get any longer. You don't grow any taller because that epiphyseal plate has fused, and it is now bone instead of cartilage. Well, they thought if we fracture this bone right through the epiphyseal plate, will that lead to any long-term damage? And they thought that it might stunt the growth of the individual because cartilage doesn't repair itself very well. So you could make the argument, all right, well, if this is cartilage and we fracture it, we tear right through it, is this individual going to stop growing from this space, or will the bone grow from each end to eventually meet? And what they found was that it did in fact stunt the growth of that bone on that end. So you have your quote unquote long bones, like your femur, right? That's an easy one, or your humerus, like the two of the longer bones in your body. You've got at the very ends, you've got this little right where the ends are, you've got this little line, and that's going to be your epiphyseal plate, and the bone grows from there. So it grows out this way. And again, if you were to fracture through that growth plate and tear it, you would stop growing. It would stop growing just on that spot. Now, these long bones have two of them. So if you just stopped growing on this end, you would continue to grow on this end, right? And that's just the way it works, and that's what they found. So where was I going with that? I feel like I talked in circles for there. So they wanted to know if there was any way that they could change that from happening, right? If there's any medical interventions that they could perform that would allow the bone to start growing again. If there's any way that they could speed it up faster to get it to where it would grow again and all those things. And that's why they went through probably hundreds of children and fracturing their bones. And it's probably more than likely going to be a big bone so that they can actually study it. So you're probably looking, again, like I said, at the humerus or the femur to try to find out. And those are very painful fractures. They're debilitating, especially the femur. Gross stuff, right? But they found that no, they weren't able to accelerate the healing. They weren't able to make the bone grow again via drugs or any other medical intervention, like splinting or bracing or anything like that. But so the way they did this, the way they'd fracture these bones would be either surgically or through like blunt force trauma. So they'd either hit them with something like a sledgehammer, or they would go in and physically cut it through that space. And you hear these studies where they weren't using anesthesia. They probably did that as well. You can imagine that's a ton of pain for these individuals. If they were able to grow up and become adults after the liberation of these camps, they were probably pretty messed up for the entirety of their lives. And these were young children, right? Because the epiphyseal plates don't fuse until at the end of puberty, right? So you're talking about for young girls like mid-teens. You're talking about for young boys like late teens. Kind of sad. The outcomes were growth stunting, right? So now, in addition to dealing with all the physical pain and the suffering, the bone stopped growing. So this child who hopefully grew up into an adult now has like a femur that's shorter than the other one, or one arm that's shorter than the other one, because of these studies. A lot of infection came out of this, right? Because if you're going in and you're surgically cutting or breaking like down at the bone layer, these bones, and you're not using anesthesia, and you're probably not using like very clean environments because they just didn't care, you probably ended up with some infections that ultimately ended up killing most of them. Obviously, there's a lot of pain and suffering with this. It is not more than likely fun, not even just physically, but emotionally. Probably huge bats of like PTSD after something like this. In this being probably the least of your worries. If you're one of the kids that got selected to have this procedure done, you were probably glad that it wasn't explosives testing or like flamethrower testing or something to that degree. And then a lot of them died. Like most of the children ended up passing away from these procedures, whether it be via infection or they moved on to some other type of experiment as they got older. Right. So that's the story of Unit 731. All right. Next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to talk about how that led to the misunderstandings within our current culture. All right, so if you haven't been able to put two and two together yet, the way that this affects our current culture, right? And this is so weird, right? Because this is a quote unquote like an old wives' tale that has just stuck around. I still get these questions from parents, and for the most part, it's not their fault. Who the hell is going to take the time to dive into something like this to get the answer? But weight training stunting your growth. Believe it or not, I also have had doctors tell some of the kids, like general internists, not like an orthopedic doctor or anything, but tell some of the kids that train here that they are going to have their growth stunted or they're going to get injured training with weights, right? Not the case. Doesn't exist. I'll link in the description to the episode that I did where we talked about all the benefits, all the studies that show that weight training actually does the complete opposite of what it's been purported to do for the past 7 to 8 decades here in America. But so they found that fracturing the bone through a growth plate can and does stunt the growth of that end of the bone. Not the bone as a whole, but just that side of it, which is like an unwanted outcome, obviously. We don't want to stunt the growth of our kids or for me, like the kids that I work with, right? So if that force, right, that they use to break that bone can stop that bone from growing, right? And weight training involves production of force, right? Weight training now can stunt your growth, right? So they went from, we purposefully broke these bones, right, and that stopped them from growing, to weight training will stunt your growth because it will break the bones. That is, again, quite the leap. That is, there's no basis in reality when it comes to that. There aren't a lot of bone fractures in the gym, especially when it comes to coaches that know what they're doing. And, here's the thing. You're going to deal with forces on the field of play that are exponentially higher than anything you'll ever deal with here in the gym, right? For example, if I'm sprinting and I go to slow down, slowing down and changing direction, you're going to generate more force and have to overcome more force than you will ever be sniffing here in the gym. We're talking about like 3 to 5 times your body weight. So to make it easy, a 100-pound kid running as hard as they can, has to stop on a dime, turn around and go the other way, you're going to have to overcome upwards of 300 to 500 pounds, right? Name me a kid that weighs 100 pounds that will be sniffing a 300 to 500 pound squat or deadlift, right? It just doesn't happen. So the forces that we deal with in the gym are nowhere near what we'll deal with on the field. So you can rest assured that like your weight training in the gym, doing like a 100-pound squat isn't going to keep you from reaching your full height potential. It just doesn't work that way. All right, well, there you have it. That is the story of how the Japanese government and Unit 731 misshaped our understanding of youth weight training here in the United States and the West in general for the past 70 to 80 years. There's quite the difference between forcefully and purposefully breaking a bone at the growth plate or the epiphyseal plate and weight training, right? And just remember that very last thing I said in the last segment, you will deal with forces on the field well in excess of anything you'll ever be sniffing here in the gym. So that 150-pound deadlift, right, is nothing compared to you slowing down, speeding up, or going to change direction. They aren't even comparable. The field wins out every single time. So if you are somebody who has a kid or works with kids and wants them to grow and get bigger and stronger and faster and more resilient, get them in the weight room because that's what they need and that's what's going to benefit them by far more than anything else, more than speed work, more than mobility work, more than any of that, because it will encompass all of it. The one physiological adaptation that we can gain that will have a positive benefit on literally every other part of fitness, including flexibility and mobility, is going to be strength. So if you can do one thing, go get stronger. All right, that's going to be it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed it. It's a little bonus episode this week. I had a little bit of extra time, so I figured I'd try to get more of these out there. Like I said, I've got some interviews coming up. I got one with one of my buddies who's a nutritionist. I've got another one that I'm trying to schedule with a strength and conditioning coach out of a small university up in Canada, and we're going to kind of keep trying to go down that path where we do episodes like this, and we do episodes where we talk to other strength and conditioning coaches. I find that I don't have a lot of time to talk to these coaches throughout the day, so if I can schedule an interview, I can really kind of keep up with a lot of the things that are happening at other places that could be a benefit and of value to the people that I train every day. So if you haven't yet, go check out Total Hockey Training and the Dynamic Effort Method for Athletes. And I don't have a copy of it, but Simple Strength. They're all available on Amazon. You can find them on my website as well. I'll link all of it in the description below. Everybody, hope you have a Merry Christmas. Enjoy the time off. If you get a couple days off, spend some time with your family. And we will see you next time.
I don't want to hear you, 'cause you cannot master the